So yesterday I put up at the top of a Contract and Fee Through Theta's YouTube channel a section, one individual video from a long series of talk pieces linked together under the construction of this sham or dissimulated performance of reiterating a talk piece of David Ann's. And of course, the discussion that I provide is clearly outside of what David Anton actually performs as I'm filming him again and again and again in what is a much shorter talk piece of his own. And but the content of that talk piece bears upon various themes and contents that David Anton is interested in, one of which is the story of Oedipus and Aristotle's reading, right, of Sophocles' version of that story in the form of a tragedy. And then what I do is I dissimulate this idea that Aristophanes had his own version of Oedipus, and I narrate that, and as if I were repeating what David narrated. So there are these various levels and layers of rhetorical deception that I perform, and the piece that I put up yesterday focuses on various ways in which fiction and suspended disbelief and illusion, could belong to various sorts of muses. And at one point, I don't take too great pains to do so, but I spend some time distinguishing between the kinds of lies that are told by our current president and the kinds of performances of suspended disbelief and fictive storytelling that exists in other contexts and and that that don't so obviously exhibit malignant and terrifying intentions. And the erasure of history and history's relationship to some kind of truth, whether it's objective or subjective, or an attempt, to approximate the actuality of the compass of individuals' various sorts of experience, always, falls on the side of terror, in my personal opinion. That is, I'll repeat that again in a simpler way. Censorship is always authoritarian, and of course, a big part of this current presidency involves the rewriting of history and the dismantling of historical, and I won't necessarily use this term, singularly, but a kind of truth that belongs to what can be told, and that belongs to the actual experience, lived experience of individuals who are, either under conditions of freedom allowed to tell their stories, or under authoritarianism and fascism denied the right to tell their stories. So first of all, this story that we're going to focus on today is a story about lives that one is no longer able to talk about. In other words, it's an erasure of certain individuals' stories. And of course, the stories that are being erased are the stories of African American slaves who were owned by the first president of the United States, George Washington. And the story of George Washington's ownership of slaves is not historically contested, right? So as close as we can, objectively use the word, these narratives are just a matter of facts, right? And what's interesting is that, many things are interesting in a terrifying kind of way, which, very much this terrifying kind of way belongs to the vision of George Orwell and his understanding of the ministry of truth and Big Brother's, insistence upon, rewriting history and to serve, right, the interests of Big Brother. And this is pretty much where we're at right now. So these stories that are not allowed to be told, right, belong to, a particular part of America, and to imagine that the erasure, right, of the story of these lives that are told in this particular exhibit that is being deconstructed and censored, right? To imagine that the removal of these stories is anything other than racist and discriminatory is completely ridiculous. It's as ridiculous as imagining that Donald Trump's 2 full-page, ad in the New York Times condemning the exonerated 5 and basically asking the court to commit them to a death sentence, and never, apologizing for this act, even when they were exonerated. These 5 young men of color, imagining, that in any way whatsoever didn't fall under this category of white supremacist, racist bigotry is utterly and completely ridiculous. And the same argument, can be made here. The erasure of the story of these individuals' lives, right, is justified under the terms that house what it means to be an American. And for someone like Trump and his racist flunkies, George Washington is the American, but the slaves he owned are of no consequence, and their stories don't represent, right? Don't represent part of the American history. So expunging the truth to preserve the, in quotation marks, dignity of a white man who owned slaves is the directive of this project, which is blatantly and obviously white supremacist and racist bigotry. We'll look at some of the language that they use. Disparage here. Members of the National Park Service removed signage around the President's House historic site on Independence Mall on Thursday afternoon in what appeared to be the fulfillment of an executive order from the White House meant to remove displays in America's national parks that, in quotation marks, disparage the nation. And the story of these slaves' lives that are being erased and censored, this is not considered a form of disparagement? In what manner is it not disparaging? Because those lives don't matter to him. Because black lives do not matter to white supremacist racists like Donald Trump. And one could say that that's an interpretation of this story and not an objective fact. But the interpretation is so baldly there on the very surface of this story that it can hardly be neglected or overlooked, if one knows how to read and comprehend in any way, shape, or form, right? So the signage was part of the exhibition, The President's House, Freedom and Slavery in the Making of a New Nation, which was unveiled in December 2010. It provided information about the 9 enslaved people who then President George Washington brought with him to the Philadelphia presidential residence and Washington's ties to slavery. What's interesting is that it says provided information. It's not even stories. And the reason that it's not even stories is because the stories of these individuals who were owned by the first president of the United States were not recorded because they were not considered of value. And once again, they're not being considered of value. So what we could make out of that information and turn into a story, and our need to turn it into a story or several stories, many stories, right? Even that information is being erased. So part of what we're going to attempt to do today is find sites that still retain some of this information, and we'll go ahead and read them before they disappear. And even the information that we would very much like to turn into story, is removed, and the lives of these individuals are censored still further. And here's an image of the removal of this documentation and exhibit. Starting after 3 p.m., placards were ripped from the wall around the site with crowbars as people walked by, some heading to the Liberty Bell Center. Signs were unbolted from the poles overlooking the dig site where America's first White House had stood until 1832. They were stacked together alongside a wall and then taken away around 4:30 p.m. in a Park Service truck. No indication was provided where the signs and the exhibition parts will go. "It's a damn shame," said one onlooker who didn't wish to be identified as he walked by, all because of one man. And it's not all because of one man. It's because of all of the men who support a man like that. If y'all don't do what Big Brother tells you to do, then Big Brother doesn't have the power, right? So all of those individuals who do what this one man says and allow this one man to continue rewriting history and erasing our lives, erasing the lives of Americans, Yeah, all of you who allow that and don't fight and don't struggle and don't resist and don't put up stuff that's going to get censored, well, it's all because of all of you, right? Without anyone behind him, this one man would be nothing more than a bruised hand and a fragile person who can barely walk downstairs, barely lift a glass of water to his lips. So it's not all because of one man. It's because of the hysteria of the American public, the racism that occupies America today. It's because of the refusal of some individuals to recognize the truth, which is that they support fascism in the guise of this man. In fact, they worship it, and will continue to do so, and probably follow the devil into hell. I truly believe that. Billy Penn reached out to both the National Park Service and the Department of the Interior by email Thursday, but neither had responded by the time this article was published. Delaware County resident Juan Suarez had brought his family visiting from Colombia to see Independence National Historical Park and the exhibit on Thursday afternoon. He was surprised when he saw the signs being taken down. I've been living in Philadelphia. I mean, think about the meaning of that word. For like 23 years, and I remember when it was first shocking to discover these quarters, he said, it's history, you know. You can either run away from it or you can actually face it and accept it and try to do better. But the fact they're going to erase this is outrageous. And then there's a picture as this gentleman removes the monument. Juan Suarez from Delaware County visiting the president's house with relatives from Colombia. Stay tuned. The president's house came under scrutiny after Donald Trump signed an executive order in March titled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History. And the title is extraordinarily Big Brother, isn't it? It's right out of 1984. So restoring truth means removing stories. These stories, these narratives are undisputed. There's no historian that denies the truth that George Washington owned these individual human beings, right? So restoring truth means removing the truth. Restoring truth means removing the truth, and sanity means denying narratives which actually occurred. That's sanity. Sanity is like the way that the Nazis used sanitation, right? Like cleansing, right? This is cleansing. This is a fascist cleansing of our history, right? Under the guise of this incredible irony to call the erasure of truth, and to call the insanity of being unable to bear looking and witnessing the truth of our American history, putting one's head in the sand and covering one's eyes as sanity, the ridiculousness of it. It called for the removal from federal monuments, memorials, and similar sites of displays that contain descriptions, depictions, or other content that inappropriately disparage Americans past or living. Now, what is interesting to me, and I had begun this discussion with the suggestion of this, some people are allowed to be regarded as Americans and some aren't, right? In what way is it not disparaging and inappropriate to erase the history of an African American slave's life. It's obviously so, but not so obviously so if you're a white supremacist racist that only imagines that a founding father like George Washington is worthy of respect and narrative and information and depiction, and that only someone like that is protected, right, by this kind of ethnic cleansing that Trump wants to produce across our country. Instead, it said those sites should showcase the greatness of the achievements and progress of the American people. And then I'll stop there, because in what way is the abolition of slavery not an achievement and progress? That's precisely what it is. What example of greatness and progress and achievement can you imagine that's greater and more progressive than the abolition of slavery? So how would you not want to commemorate that? How would you not want to commemorate the civil rights movement? How would you not want to commemorate any aspect of American culture, right, that progressed and produced, right, the greatness of recognizing where it went wrong to begin with, and attempted to correct those errors? How would you not imagine that those were the greatest achievements? Not recognizing Juneteenth? How would you not recognize the greatness of ending slavery? Quote, the greatness of the achievements and progress of the American people, or, with respect to natural features, the beauty, abundance, and grandeur of the American landscape. I don't want to get too much into that, but I do think it's somewhat ironic, for someone, who fails to recognize, the harm that we do to planet Earth, to call for, the respect of natural features such the beauty, grandeur, and abundance of the American landscape, when everything, in the name of capitalism, is producing profit, right, at the expense of our natural landscape and the resources that we have that belong to this planet. And there's quite a bit of irony there, but it kind of exceeds the purview of what we're looking at today. Signs were placed near those sites, directing people to report any parts of historical sites that they felt didn't align with the executive order's message. Well, that's very Big Brother right there. Right? Turn in your neighbors, turn in your fellows, and if you called out the fact that, erasing these things is part of that disrespect, they can't even hear it. They can't even hear it because the mindset is so inherently white supremacist and racist. that they can't even understand, like, how disparaging it is to erase the lives of these individuals in the name of this beauty, abundance, and grandeur. The actions in Philadelphia do not appear to be part of a wider national sweep. I don't know. Avenging the Ancestors Coalition, ATAC, a group that had a key role in ensuring that the history of the enslaved people was recognized and had been protesting the impending move, called the removal historically outrageous and blatantly racist, as I have been calling it. But ATAC has been ready, attorney Michael Cord, the founder of ATAC, wrote in a response for comment. Stay tuned, we will announce our powerful action shortly. The Inquirer reports that Mayor Sherelle Parker's office has responded to the sign's removal by filing a lawsuit claiming the federal government did not honor a 2006 cooperative agreement that may require advance notice of changes to the site. As of Thursday evening, information about the President's House's history and its ties to slavery remain available on the National Parks Service website. And so we'll visit that and read it and record it before it goes away. As the sun set Thursday, the only remnant of the exhibit was the etched names of the 9 enslaved people on a wall near the entrance to the Liberty Bell. Suarez said that people will not simply forget the history behind the exhibition because the signs are gone. This display, it's very moving, he said. It teaches all of us a really big lesson, that freedom is not free, that actually people had to fight and struggle and even go to war and give up their lives so that all of us could be free here. The fact that we are going to take this down so they could try to erase that part of history is sad, outrageous, and shocking. And then, and there's a link. Oh, that's not what I wanted to link to. Here's the information. And we'll go ahead and read this and record it before it disappears. In the 1790s, at the President's House location at 6th and Market Streets, Presidents George Washington and John Adams lived and conducted their executive branch business. Washington brought some of his enslaved Africans to this site, and they lived and toiled with other members of his household during the years that our first president was guiding the experimental development of the young nation toward modern Republican government. Washington's large household, including enslaved African descendants, contrasted with Adams' small household. Adams never owned slaves. That's an interesting fact. The President's House in the 1790s was a mirror of the young republic, reflecting both the ideals and contradictions of the new nation. The house stood in the shadow of Independence Hall, where the words, "all men are created equal," and then that's the irony right there, and "we the people" were adopted, but they did not apply to all who lived in the new United States of America. And then there's some stuff. So, let's see, history of the President's House site. Let's try this one. President's House site, enslaved people in the Washington household. The 9 enslaved people. The enslaved people who lived and worked at the President's House were integral parts of the complex life of the household. They did not simply react to events. They were dynamic participants in the daily life of the family and the city. President Washington knew and trusted his enslaved house staff enough to buy them tickets for the circus and theater and let them venture out into the city's markets on their own. I find that sentence annoying and insensitive and ridiculous and condescending and apologetic. These outings allowed the staff to observe the lives of free blacks living in the city and offered opportunities for communication with Philadelphia's active abolitionist community, which I also doubt. And it's funny that, I mean, this is hardly like radical stuff, right? I mean, it's totally apologetic from the outset. Like they're removing this apologistic discourse. It's hilarious. I mean, it's already like so softened, as if being a slave wasn't really all that bad, and you get to go out for candy and chocolate on Saturday. It's pretty ridiculous. If anything, that we would want to remove it and put up a more reasonable interpretation of the lives of slaves in the time of George Washington. But to be offended that this apologetic, right, representation is just too much, for our first white supremacist, president to have born, is kind of ridiculous. Too often, people who are little known as individuals in historical documents are neglected when interpreting the past for modern audiences. And I guess like the great irony there is, well, now they're not, minimally neglected. They're just completely erased. Interpretation of life in the president's house gives us an opportunity to give names and faces to a few of the thousands of free and enslaved people of African descent who were part of Philadelphia society. And then these aren't even stories. They're just like they barely identify these individuals. Austin, the half brother of Ona Judge, who worked as a postilion, a horseman, and stable hand, he died on December 20th, 1794. After a fall from a horse, leaving a wife and 5 children. So he died in the service of George Washington. Christopher Shields became Washington's personal attendant as a teenager after his uncle, who was with the general throughout the Revolution, became incapacitated. A literate man, Shields attempted to escape in 1799, but was unsuccessful. And what's really interesting is like this stuff up here, like that says they did not simply react to events. They were dynamic participants in the daily life of the family in the city, and it makes it. And they got to go out and they got tickets to the circus. It's like, well, if it was all that great, then why would one risk one's life, right? Attempting to escape like the terror and humiliation of slavery, right? So like even within the document that that was removed, like the extraordinary, irony of the disparity, between the individual descriptions of these people and this abstraction up here that tries to make it palpable, right? Shields attempted to escape in 1799 but was unsuccessful. His fate after Martha Washington's 1802 death is unknown. Gilles was a driver, postilion, and stable hand. He returned to Mount Vernon in 1791 after being injured in an accident during Washington's tour of the southern states. He died before 1799. Hercules was the chief cook during Washington's stay in Philadelphia. He was celebrated for his mastery of his craft and exacting standards for kitchen workers. Accounts differ about his flight to freedom, but Hercules fled from bondage in 1797. Hercules would have been legally freed by the terms of Washington's will, but his wife and children remained in bondage. They were dour slaves. Joe Richardson is mentioned in 1795 records as Postilion Joe. Although his time in Philadelphia is uncertain, he was married to a woman freed along with their children after Washington's 1799 death, whereupon the family took the name Richardson. Moll was nursemaid to Martha Washington's 2 grandchildren. Before Martha's marriage at Mount Vernon, she had served as nursemaid to Martha's children. Oni Judge was, like her mother, a talented seamstress. She became Martha Washington's personal maid as a teenager. In 1796, Judge escaped to New Hampshire, where she lived until her 1848 death. So a lot of runaway slaves, even though they got to go venture out into the city's markets and got tickets to the circus. In New Hampshire, she married a free black sailor named Jack Staines and had 3 children, who all died before she did. Paris was a young stable hand. He was returned to Mount Vernon in 1791 for unsatisfactory behavior and died in 1794. I find that euphemism of unsatisfactory behavior terrifying. Richmond came to Philadelphia at the age of 11 with his father Hercules. Although his father was not a dour slave, his mother was, making Richmond and his sisters dour slaves by association. He worked as a scullion in the kitchen for a year and returned to Mount Vernon. And then apparently there's an attempt at narrative. Ona Judge seizes her freedom. After Ona Judge escaped from Philadelphia, Washington attempted to recapture her. So George Washington effectively became a slave hunter. He found out where she was when a friend of Martha Washington's granddaughter happened to encounter Judge in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Washington wrote to the Collector of Customs in Portsmouth requesting that he apprehend Judge and send her back. The New Hampshire official who, after speaking with Judge, declined to do so. So there was somebody that refused, right, to return this human being who George Washington believed was his property to George Washington. Good for him. Like these these are the resistors that we're looking for. The New Hampshire official, after speaking with Judge, declined to do so. 2 years later, Washington asked his secretary and nephew, Burwell Bassett Jr., to seize Judge and her child born since her escape. Bassett confided his intentions to John Langdon, the governor of New Hampshire, while dining with him. But Langdon sent a warning to Judge. She escaped yet again and fled the town with her child. So George Washington is going after her. Has been intent on recovering, right, in quotation marks, his property for quite some time, and she attempts this poor woman, attempts a second escape. Near the end of her life, when Judge was old and had outlived all of her family, people who spoke with her were impressed by her dignity, her faith in God, and her abiding love of freedom. Hercules seizes his freedom. As the Washington's chef, Hercules maintained strict discipline in the kitchen, and President Washington allowed Hercules to sell the leftovers from state banquets. With this income, Hercules improved his wardrobe. He was seen in clothing made of linen of exceptional whiteness and quality, with black silk breeches, waistcoat, and stockings. Donning a blue coat with a velvet collar and bright metal buttons, Hercules was known to enjoy his evening promenade in Philadelphia with a gold-headed cane in hand, kind of like Al Green. In 1791, Hercules knew that he was being sent home to Virginia to avoid getting his freedom legally through Pennsylvania's Gradual Abolition Act. When Hercules' son, Richmond, was caught stealing, or perhaps a lie was invented that he was stealing, at Mount Vernon in the summer of 1796, that would have been a good excuse to engage some kind of disciplinary action. Washington took the precaution to leave Hercules in Virginia. While Washington was enjoying his birthday celebration in Philadelphia the next February, it was reported that Hercules went missing from Mount Vernon, obviously trying to escape. Despite efforts to locate and recapture him, Hercules remained free. So he managed to free himself from the human tragedy of slavery imposed on him by George Washington. And that's it. That's all that's there. There's another site. Let's see. Or we can take the IQ test and see if we're as intelligent as Donald Trump. I'm not sure if any of these any of this information is a repetition of the other side. Well, this is at the www.ushistory.org/president's-house/numbers.php site. So that information may or may not also all be censored. See if there's any other relevant information. It looks like there are actually a few more or expanded biographies here. So I'll put up a link to this site so that everyone can read these and record these before they're censored, if they are, by our government, which I suppose seems to believe that it can censor anything that it finds offensive in spite of our Constitution and our rights of free speech. So once again, and I'll put up a link on this, just copy that. this information is available for the time being.